Okay, welcome to Chapter 5. So Chapter 5 is on incident response and contingency planning, page 175. So learning objectives talks about, the need for contingency planning. That's fairly obvious. What are the major components involved? The processes associated with digital forensics, and then crisis management and testing, because you can't just have a plan without testing it. So opening case, talk about, insurance to recover, replacement cost and, offsite backup tested maybe. All plans were on the computer. Okay, that sounds reasonable. Well, we'll get into that. So introduction, page 176. So plan for the unexpected adverse events. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. So about 40% of businesses, is estimated, don't have a plan. And so when something goes wrong, they just basically crumble. So there's important terminology here, and I tend to disagree with the textbook because I'm dealing with real life, not academics. But disaster recovery is not the kind of term that the CEO is really going to appreciate. Disaster recovery to the CEO sounds like insurance. Like, oh, well, a car ran into the building. We have insurance for that. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about business continuity or business resumption. In other words, the goal here is to get you back into business as soon as practical. Now that the CEO will look at it and go, oh, business resumption? No, okay, got it. So I don't like to use the word disaster recovery when I'm talking to senior management. It's just not a good idea. Okay, so plans to cover how to identify the problems, contain any incidents, resolve an adverse impact. Yep. So some companies, limit the number of key people that are on a flight. For example, the royal family in England, you don't send everybody on the same plane. You break them up into two planes just in case something happens. I mean, that sounds kind of crazy, but yeah, that's incident and response and contingency planning, risk reduction. So I'm going to probably add an awful lot to this chapter because this is something that's near and dear to my heart. So you just got to, a lot of the stuff will not be in the book, so you have to kind of pay attention. Okay. So contingency planning on page 177. So planning, for the unexpected. So there are four major components for planning. Talk about the business impact analysis. If this went down, how would it affect business? That'll tell you what is the most critical. If you did business impact analysis, tell you which one is going to cause you the most amount of pain. Incident response plan, the IR plan. This is what you do immediately. This is how you get boots on the ground. In other words, for example, a classic example is you have a guard force, and when they see something going on, they don't rush out and try to put the fire out themselves. They call the fire department, right? So that's what we're talking about here is somebody detects there's a problem, and then other people, specialists in what the problem is, get called out. So the disaster recovery plan, even though I don't particularly like that term, it's a legitimate term. That's about restoring operations, probably at the current site. Most likely we're talking about that. And then a business continuity plan probably means you're going to continue operations at another site. Now, these are not hard and fast rules, but it's a very common theme that you see. Restoring operations at some sort of an alternate site. So here's basically what the hierarchy of the plan, some sort of contingency planning. And then you have to come up with the business impact analysis, which will include the priority. And then incident response planning. How do you tell people what is an incident and who do you call? Ghostbusters. No. And then this disaster recovery planning and crisis management, they all call this business resumption planning. Okay. I just call it business continuity because, again, when talking to the CEO, you probably don't want to use too many of these terms. You might have a contingency planning management team, a CPMT. Okay, so this is if you don't have these things, you're probably not doing your due diligence. You don't really have, if you haven't picked out what's important and taken steps to protect it and being able to operate after that thing is gone. I mean, a tornado goes through and wipes out your sales department. You're going to, have them work from home and dial into this location and, lots of things involved. So there's a planning life cycle. Of course there is. So, you form some sort of a, contingency planning management team, and you develop the policy statement first. Here's what we're going to do, who's going to do it, because if you don't assign people, a task to a person, it rarely gets done. And then the business impact analysis, determine the mission, identify the resources, identify recovery priorities. And then you have subordinate teams that are for, the incident response and disaster recovery, business continuity. So you develop those subordinate plans, integrate that back in, identify whatever preventive controls, organize a response, and then create a response strategy, all the way through. Okay, so basically we're talking 7 major steps. A policy statement, conducting the business impact analysis, identifying controls, creating contingency plans, developing the contingency plan, test, train, and exercise. It's extraordinarily important that you test and train and exercise these things, because an untested plan is not a real plan. And then ensure the maintenance of the thing, because maintenance basically means things change. You may say, well, in a case of a disaster, we need to take this server and move it over to this location. Well, it's no longer there. It's not even a server anymore. It's a, Hyper-V server. It's not even physical. So, what do you have to do? Okay. So business impact analysis is basically where it starts, right? That's where the hard work is. So we need to have, the document. You should start with the scope. Which parts of the organization are we actually dealing with? All of them? Plan, you need to be pointing in the right direction. Some sort of a balance, because you can't do everything, and prioritization is always tough. Somebody's going to say, but my organization is more important than their organization. How come you didn't put me first? Okay, here's a classic example. Let's say the phone and internet system went out. Which do you do first, phone or internet? Where do you put your priorities? Well, some people are going to say, oh, but phone is the most important thing. It needs to go first. And other people are going to say, well, we don't care about the dang phone. We need the internet to be able to do our job. So you're not going to get a consistent answer. And then follow up to make sure that management is on board with what you just came up with. So this whole BIA thing is kind of sort of important. So anybody remember, if you were around at the time, we had a hellacious freeze in February of 2021. And it was bad. I mean, you had people with no power and no water in the, in the immediate area of Killeen, for days. And, some people it went like almost a week. So what kind of contingency planning could you do for that? I mean, if I knew in advance that I was going to lose water, well, I could have, had some, empty milk jugs or stuff with water. Or maybe if I was smart enough, I could, fill the bathtub full of water and that kind of stuff, right? And if I knew the electricity is going to be out for several days, maybe I'd invested in a generator or, battery backups, etc. So being able to predict the future is how you get here. You have to come up with, how bad is it going to be? How's this going to affect my business? What am I going to do? Okay. So recovery criticality. Evaluate each organization's requirements, because they're not going to be the same. Not everyone has equal importance. Phones or internet, I don't know. Is it more important to fill existing orders or take new orders? You may get some different opinion on that. It's like, well, no, we still need to, well, wait a minute now. Which is more important to you? Order fulfillment or new orders? And then, of course, you're going to have turf wars. You're going to have people that say, no, my organization's more important than yours. And this is going to show up with the people who are developing, the plan. So one of the ways you can do this is a weighted analysis. You've seen this kind of thing before, where, how important is customer sales? How important is the production line? How important is all the customer service, research and development, employee support? So, for example, customer service, is a 2, but customer sales is a 5, right? So impact on revenue, impact on profitability, impact on service delivery, on market share, on reputation, and then you come up with this total that basically says customer sales is going to be number 1. This sounds a little weird, but if you were only going to be down for like an hour, then having customer sales down for an hour, people would definitely know. But order fulfillment, if they were down for an hour, it's likely no one would know. So again, from a customer's point of view, right? All right, cool. So there's some really key terms here, and yeah, this is kind of stuff that unfortunately you're probably going to have to memorize because some of these things are kind of crazy. You know, a recovery time objective and a recovery point objective. Recovery time is how long does it take to get back to the way we were? So a classic example where this is important is, customer sales. You know, I want that thing as fast as humanly possible and get me back quick so I can start making more sales and more money. On the other hand, if you have a bi-weekly payroll and the payroll system went down on a Tuesday, well, my recovery time objective could be, 12 days in the future, right? It's not that important. I mean, it has to be running when payroll runs, but I don't have to have it running now. So that kind of stuff. So recovery point objective. So I could say, I want this to be exactly the way it was before and no catching up. Otherwise, I'm going to bring you back to yesterday morning, and you're going to have to re-enter the data that occurred before the disaster happened. Okay, so the recovery point. Do I want everything except for maybe the last 5 or 6 seconds before the tornado hit or whatever? So knowing that is going to change how you do your contingency planning, because I'm going to have to buy some more servers. I'm going to have to do 5 nines availability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So recovery time and recovery point are kind of important. So recovery point could be the date and time from the last backup. Okay, now I've seen most organizations who just have like a file server, right? I mean, we're not talking about business. We're talking about just, the profitability kind of thing. We're just talking about office people that are producing Word documents, PowerPoint presentations, Excel, etc. A daily backup is probably sufficient. If they lost a day's worth of work, it'd be like annoying, but not all that impactful when it comes to the profitability. So on this next one, they talk about kind of the difference between the two. So when was the last time that a backup was made? And then some sort of an incident happened in the middle of the day. Boom. So how far back do I go to do a recovery? And then how far forward does it take me to get to the point where I can do work again? So those are the two kinds of things. Kind of makes sense? So if the recovery point is, it's okay if you at noon, you have to redo some stuff. Okay. All right. Kind of making sense? So there's it's called a work recovery time, which is how long it takes to do the restore and to re-enter any lost data. And then a maximum tolerable downtime. This is how much can I take before it starts affecting business. Now, again, if you're talking about sales, the maximum tolerable downtime might be like 1 or 2 minutes. But if you're doing payroll, maximum tolerable downtime, hey, as long as it's done over the weekend, by next weekend, I'm happy, right? Okay. So affecting business. So the maximum tolerable downtime is the RTO plus the work recovery time. In other words, how long does it take, and then how much effort am I going to have to put in there to be able to bring me back? So here's an example of how that looks. Okay, this is a good place to stop before we dive into this guy a little bit more.